Yeah, I'm actually gonna take a deep breath here because yeah, this is heavy stuff and it's hard and that's where I'm feeling even in this moment like a little bit of pressure to have an answer and there isn't an answer. So like I want to be just very clear about that. There isn't an answer. What this means is actually wading into a space where there isn't an answer.
Mm.
And I like to think about it in terms of like in ACT, acceptance and commitment therapy, the idea of creative hopelessness. And it's like about really actually going into the hopelessness of the situation because like there are things that we can't and won't ever be able to change. And if we can simply accept the part that we can't, then we get to play with all the creativity around like what else can I actually influence and control.
Welcome to Citizen Rebel, the podcast for founders, small business owners, and bold influencers who refuse to stay silent.
These are the stories of entrepreneurs and creators risking everything to speak up, to stand out, and to stand for something.
And for those of us feeling unsure of how to react or what to say and do, this is a place where we can figure it out together.
This is Citizen Rebel, stories of brands taking a stand. Subscribe now wherever you get your podcasts. Hi, I'm Alaina.
And I'm Chris.
And welcome to another episode of Citizen Rebel. It's been, Chris, we missed you on the last episode so much.
I'm so sorry. I was at the zoo in Toronto and got some scheduling confused. And yeah, really wish I would have been there.
You know, I need to point out, you did not confuse any scheduling. I screwed up the scheduling.
Well, we could make it passive and just say the scheduling was screwed up and then there's no fault or blame applied. How about that?
I do need accountability with my scheduling. Otherwise, it will not get better. So it's okay that we acknowledge that it was on me. So we did miss you very much, and I'm so glad that you're back and tuning in from Canada because we have a very big episode today. Yeah.
That's right.
One thing before we begin and introduce our guest, I want to update everyone on the Find Your Voice cohorts. They are absolute magic. They're going so well. And I want to put in a quick plug. If you are listening to this show and you want to learn how to tell your story out in the world in a way in which you will feel so confident about that story, which is a gift for others when we unearth it and bring it out, please let me know. It would be a joy and honor to work with you on that. So far, the cohorts, they're just, like I said, it's magical, it's deep work, it's bigger than personal branding for so far every one of the students. And
Yeah, I
it's
mean,
some quick
it's
plug.
really interesting to see like how successful people have been with them. I mean, we just did a recap with a bunch of our beta groups and it almost feels like kind of cult like. You know, everybody's like so gushy and so excited about it. It's kind of scary.
What? Why'd you say that, Chris?
Because
And
that's my role. I'm not.
that's really, yeah, you think it might be like, no, okay. It's open to everyone. It is not a religion. But yes, okay. The enthusiasm from the past beta members has surprised even me, and they are using words like, this has changed my life. And that's more than I ever could have asked for. And we're all parts of that story, everyone who participates. And there's something absolutely awesome about it. So if you do want to learn more, go to goodisnow.com. And also, thank you to everyone who is listening. We are, almost up to 500 downloads. The show
Yeah.
is getting some traction. If you are enjoying the show, please do us a huge favor and hit follow, subscribe. But also, the best thing you can do right now is leave a review. Actually, write words, which would be really generous of you. That helps us rank in the podcast world. All right, today's guest. This is a very important episode because, and it's different than what we would normally do. Typically, we're interviewing business owners and individuals taking a stand for what they believe in, which is very tough for some of us and easier for others. Today, with that in mind, we have Jay Karr, a psychotherapist. Is that right? Are you a
Yeah.
psychotherapist?
Yeah,
Wow.
that's the kind of umbrella, but licensed professional clinical counselor, and yeah, and so I do psychotherapy. Yeah.
Yeah. And you also, tell us about your practice. But before you do that, you're here
Hmm.
to help coach us and our listeners through how to, how to get through the MAGA movement. How do we go day by day? How do we get through this psychologically when we're checking the news and it's this
Yeah.
bombardment? So, and also how do we get through telling our story publicly? It's a huge vulnerability, taking a stand, ultimate fear. So you're here for that. So now introduce yourself and your practice to us.
Yeah, here for all of that. And but my background and Lena, I've known you for for years now from my previous career where I was working in marketing and focusing really on technology. Later in that former career, and so
And hold on,
yeah.
let me set that up for you a little bit better. So when Jay and I knew each other, we did work at an ad agency. It was quite stressful. And Jay, he was just you were a different person. I mean, you right now, if you're listening and you can't see Jay, he's got a glow to his face. He's got like nice round cheeks. He's got cool hair. He's happy. He's got a big smile. Back then, he was like, you were so skinny. You were pale. You
This
were
this is
stressed.
the difference between being absolutely depressed and miserable and overworked and all the rest of it, and coming from a place of like, well, and I know we're going to be talking a lot about that idea of like alignment. How do I actually show up with me and authentically and honestly and with integrity and be a part of community and systems and businesses and commerce and the rest of it. And yeah, no, it's a pleasure for me. It's a joy to be in this space, meeting with you again and talking about kind of the shift and change just from those different environments. But I love that because it's such an example of like it's not just a story of the seed; it's a story of the soil as well. And
Oh, and where
and
you are. Yeah.
yeah, and
Yeah.
and so our environment and the ecosystems that we interact with, all of those systems, it plays back in your inner relationship with it, and so the potential, it takes both the environment and community systems as well as that individual work that we do, and so that's a lot of what I focus on in the psychotherapy work and in helping clients, and I'm so glad I have the experiences that I've had personally, as well as professionally, that I can bring to how I show up and
Yeah. And
show up in
so
that meeting.
you flicked a switch on your life and you became a
Yeah.
psychotherapist, which took years, of course, to get, qualified in your degrees and all the things you have to do. Your practice is Reclaim Your Path. You can find it at
hmm
reclaimyourpath.com. And your specialty, what would you say your specialty is?
Well, the specialty is really, trauma and trauma related disorders, and I really think about that in terms of like the way that weaves through so many different, what you might think of as depression or anxiety, but like at the core of that root is often trauma and unprocessed trauma, and so I really specialize in PTSD, complex PTSD, developmental trauma, attachment trauma, relational trauma, like all of those things, which is so interrelated to the topics that we're talking about here in terms of administration, politics, etc. And so all of that's interrelated. But that's really the focus. Now, there's many different tools that I use for that, and one of the areas of passion for me is psychedelic assisted psychotherapy, and so I really, because it's the only legal medicine at this point to use in Ohio, ketamine assisted psychotherapy, but I'm trained as well and work with psilocybin as well as MDMA, and an advocate as well for hopefully the availability of those medicines to help people, particularly with trauma.
That is
Amazing.
fascinating. I'm personally a huge fan of psychology. It's like a hobby of mine, and the whole idea of a psychedelic experience and having that
Yeah.
be controlled and be helping unlock things. It just sounds super fascinating.
It
So,
is, yeah. It's a
and
privilege, honestly, to get to do the work that I do with people and just that connected in the context of a relationship. Yeah, it's beautiful.
and in your practice today, so here we are, it's the beginning of a second MAGA administration. And is it safe to say, is this topic coming up frequently with your patients?
Yes, absolutely. And the funny thing is that like and that's part of even and as I was contemplating, the conversation here, it's, I have clients across the political spectrum, the socioeconomic spectrum that I get to interact with. And there's a privilege that I have in being able to actually see and understand them as human beings. And it's without, that interference essentially of my political beliefs. And yet the work that I do is, I would call it highly political. Like therapy work is not just the work of dealing with past trauma. And I'll steal Phil Wolfson. So he does a lot of work with ketamine-assisted psychotherapy, but he phrased the word advocacy as preventing the future trauma of others. And so I really see, my work not just of dealing with what has already happened, but how do we prevent that harm, that hurt, the abuse, all of that stuff that are those potential futures if action isn't actually taken. And so I do see, the work and how I show up is political, but it's really, focusing on those one-on-one conversations. But, one of the interesting things is I also think that it's highly political to have the privilege to not talk about the administration and what's happening. And that was something that I had to process and, work with my own therapist on, is the way in which how it was shocking to me how much it wasn't coming up in sessions for certain individuals, and then obviously like in a very deep way coming up for other individuals. And it's an interesting thing always as the therapist on the other side of it, of I'm in this along with everybody else dealing with it.
That's fascinating. I'm just wondering out loud, because I can relate to that so well. I've been working by myself at home for over 15 years, and when the pandemic hit, we had just a newborn. So yeah, I've been talking with my therapist a lot of that stuff myself. What are some of like the common things that come up? Like, is there any kind of pattern that keeps repeating itself?
Well, I mean, I would say that one of those patterns is how do I engage, but engage in a way where it's productive versus engage in a way where that becomes like maladaptive, or like, and I think of it, it can be as simple as like, that how do I stay engaged? How do I engage even in social media, let's say in news or whatever that might be, without that becoming the rabbit hole that I get lost in? And so that's one of the themes that I think is present there. And so, a lot of talk about even relationships with media and access. And then where that conversation often starts is this idea of like, it starts usually as these extremes. I think extremes are always a fun thing because there's reason to bring curiosity anytime you're at an extreme. On this pole or the opposite side of the pole, there's a charge, right, that's pulling you that way. And so very often that's playing around with the idea of, all right, well, I'm just going to detox. I'm going to totally eliminate this. And I think of like the way in which like our tendency might be to separate, and yet there are reasons why things look the way that they look. And I think really honoring like both sides of that internal conflict is part of the exploration, and that the solution very often isn't an extreme of an all or a nothing, and is somewhere in the middle. But that's so much harder to manage. And I think of like, even in that example, it's kind of like even in a relationship to food, let's say a meal, and I love pizza. Maybe I eat too much pizza, right? Like it's paying attention to the information or the data that we're getting and the choices that we make and what, the outcomes are that are associated with that. And if I notice that, I've eaten too much, then it's really paying attention and making sure that I'm becoming more aware of like when it crosses from something that's beneficial into something that isn't. And yet what we often find is that we continue, let's say, eating too much pizza. So then it's really getting curious about why that is that I'm not actually holding to a boundary that I'm setting for myself. And there's always an interesting reason why I get pulled over the lines that I know are important for me. And so I'd say that the answer for that's going to be different for each of us as far as the why, but the process of that I think is pretty shared, universal, or common even in some of what's been coming up.
And so this is a common thing I'm hearing too, is people saying, I'm just not watching the news anymore. I can't. And I'm also hearing, I am watching the news, listening to the news because I know that I have to, which is refreshing. And I think what you're talking about is finding that middle zone, right? Is important, instead of
Yeah.
You can't, I think we all know this, and I think that might be where some of that tension really lies, is that this is a moment in time in which we no longer have the privilege to all tune out. We did a lot of that in 2016, the first round of this administration, and now it's becoming abundantly clear that we can't tune out. There's too much at stake, and
Yeah.
I'm curious to so finding that balance. The pizza analogy is fabulous. You know your limits. We still need to engage. This is really important too for conversations with coworkers or relatives about politics, actually, because I think
Yeah.
we probably jump into a condescending state because we think we know more. We think we have all the answers. We
Yeah.
know we know. You mentioned extremes. We know with everything that they are wrong, and that's not a place to come to it from. You have to be super curious. What I typically do is try to find common ground. Turning
Mm.
toward history is really good. We've got to go further back and back, like the moon landing. Hey, what do you think about the moon? No, but
Or
going
WW2,
back, finding, huh?
World War II, when we were fighting the
Right,
Nazis.
sure. There you
And
go.
that seems
And
to be something that people can agree is a good thing, mostly. Although
finding
these
common
days,
ground.
Yeah, or like even the flag, right, in the 90s. Like I loved all the musician examples that you were throwing out there of like,
Oh
well,
yeah.
that's when it was a shared symbol, right, for not just us but the rest of the world. And
Absolutely. And
yeah,
there's shared things. So what I'll find is, you guys know I'm a talker, and I just run around and meet people all the time and talking to everybody in the grocery store everywhere. There's geez, these groceries are so expensive, and there's so much common ground that you can get really far with people to a point in which they
yeah.
feel really safe, and then yeah, and there's that point. Let's segue to the workplace a bit and
Hmm.
externally, and then I want to get to brands and communicating externally. But let's take this example of let's say it's a company with 300 employees, and they have a stake in the way that the economy, the global stage, they probably are being affected by tariffs. Like, it's affecting potentially your job, the political moment. And yet, what I have experienced and noticed is this absolute extreme avoidance in workplaces to talking about politics. So there were rules back when we were working together, Jay, back in the early 2000s. We don't talk about politics or religion at work. Fair. Now it's different, I would say. So, what should we do about this? Like, should workplace cultures continue to avoid it? Should we be talking about it?
And I think of it, and by the way, I'm checking in with a self-conscious part. Like I mean, I work on a micro level in like interpersonal relationships, but I do think that some of this, I don't want to overgeneralize. That's my caution here. But like in generalizing, one of the things that I think of is like, well, corporations, like, in a way, they're just a mirror of the collective. Like whoever it is that's working for them, that we're all participating in, we're all complicit in. And so I think that that idea of, and this is the part where, for whatever reason, right, like bringing religion into spaces where that was prohibited before is now an acceptable thing.
Mm.
Yet we have rules where religion, that's okay, but not certain religions or not certain perspectives. And so like I actually think that part of like the cycle that's happening, it's just happening in a dysfunctional way, is about this, like it is about a fight for actually allowing us to show up with honesty and authenticity.
mm,
The dark side of that is that we actually have to reconcile with all of the collective shadow of like what our history is, as well as what our society means, which means reconciling with things like racism, which means reconciling with all of the stuff that's also there. But the challenge we have right now is that like it is this idea, and it goes back to the control, that somebody's up here basically determining, well, that's okay to say, that's not okay to say, and all of that yet is guised under this mirror of freedom of speech, and yet
Mm.
it is heavily censored and is heavily judged and is heavily punished. And that's the part that is a dramatic shift because of where the control structures exist and where that power lies. And so it's a very dysfunctional system, in other words, that we are now engaging in. And as we become complicit in that, even as an individual, and there's stuff that I choose not to say, then that perpetuates and gives more power actually to the system itself, that it perpetuates it on a deeper level. And so I really think about it in terms of like, well, for a brand to actually stand up and have a collective message, it actually has to represent all of the constituent parts, or it's an empty message. And so the thing is that like if we actually allowed space, then there's going to be, you know, some brands that are here, some brands that are there, and then there's this whole ecosystem, right, of different perspectives that would allow the marketplace and the interaction to be decided like in a free manner, and that's not what's happening right now. We can't address obviously the top down piece, but we can certainly address the bottom up. And I think about that in terms of our personal responsibility. And so much of like what we're dealing with is this idea that, oh, well, if we elect the right president, that one person is basically going to be able to fix. And that's not the case here. And I think, Alaina, this goes back to the conversation that we had previously. Like, you are the person that you've been waiting for. And it is each of our responsibility to stand up. And the thing is that I trust that if each of us individually are able to stand up, there are enough of us that is what creates movement. And that is what is going to allow for the change to happen. But it is not waiting for the right manager above me. It's not waiting for the right boss above that manager. It's not waiting for the right CEO. It is actually about standing up for what is true and authentic and what we know. And of course, it is holding all of the openness around like what I believe now is going to be different than 5 years from now. And because there's always more to learn. So it's not that, but there is and are fundamental truths like we're talking about of humanity, of like kindness. What does that mean to be kind? What does that mean to be respectful? That aren't a matter of definitions and perspectives. Like there are truths, in other words.
It seems like it kind of goes back to your safe space concept, where you know we want people to feel safe so that they don't go here, they go here, and then for the people who are Russian, not the back of the brain, the lizard brain, but the frontal cortex, so that they can engage in a way that that is measured. And I love the bottom up approach too. We talk about that a lot, is that creating that groundswell. That idea is that it's just really kind of the, and the idea of kindness is also, I think, really interesting and goes back to the safe space as well. I don't know. It'd be great to hear some like real examples. Like, I'm in the workspace. Could I imagine? I don't have an employer. I'm self-employed, so I have a lot of privilege in that. But if I was working somewhere, and we've talked to people like that, and they feel kind of trapped, they can't express themselves, and that hurts, right? It's a painful experience. Like that would be an issue, I would assume people are struggling with.
Yeah, can you speak to that, Jay? Like, if it on this individual level, those who do feel oppressed, they feel they cannot speak up or they might lose their job. Let's just unpack the psychology of that for a minute and how it can manifest physically, in your relationships in your life. And what happens to us as human beings who've been raised in what was called a free country to not feel free.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm actually going to take a deep breath here because, this is heavy stuff, and it's hard, and that's where, I'm feeling even in this moment like a little bit of pressure to have an answer, and there isn't an answer. So like I want to be just very clear about that. There isn't an answer. What this means is actually wading into a space where there isn't an answer. And I like to think about it in terms of like in ACT, acceptance and commitment therapy, the idea of creative hopelessness. And it's like about really actually going into the hopelessness of the situation, because like there are things that we can't and won't ever be able to change. And if we can simply accept the part that we can't, then we get to play with all the creativity around like, what else can I actually influence and control? And so even when some of those things are very hard and fixed, you got to feel it. You got to really connect with that on a deep level, and then free up that space basically to make the choices where there is a choice. And this is always true. And I mean, I'm founded, in an existential frame as far as my orientation, it was fundamentally like set when I read the book Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. And so
Such a
anything
good
that,
book.
right, like no matter what, like that choice of not externally what's happening out here, but what's happening in here, there's nobody that can ever take that away from me. And so I would say that it will get harder, and it is going to get harder for people. And there are those very real things that I don't want to diminish by saying, oh, just go get another job. Like
Right.
that may not be an
Absolutely.
option.
Yeah,
Yeah.
So
absolutely.
so is it similar, like the concept of finding comfort in discomfort and figuring out a way to be okay with that, and maybe
Yeah.
acknowledging to myself, oh, I'm feeling uncomfortable right now. Oh, this is really making me feel nervous or scared, and that in itself might be a good first step. I don't know.
Yeah, and I would take that step further of like, of course it's hard. Of course this is like, and like, what I mean by that is like really offering ourselves a self-compassion for how difficult it is in that
Mm.
given situation.
Yeah.
And
And
is it helpful if yeah, let's say you absolutely cannot say something in your work environment. There are, what about outside of that environment in your community? Have you seen that that is helpful? I mean, let's talk about these creative ways to get around it, I suppose, and what
yeah,
you can control,
yeah.
because I think people need that answer.
Oh, and Elena, that's such a great way of putting it because, like, our experience, the internal subjective experience of like what it means to be Jay, for instance, is it's a combination of like all of those things. And so when yes, I might have a context domain or space where that can't happen, it's so important then that I still as an individual can be fulfilled and find other channels, domains, avenues, relationships, etc., where that is there. And so I'm thinking, even in my own life, like the deep, close friendships that I have, that isn't just about like, ruminating in terms of like churning over, but like I need space, for instance, where I actually get to let out like the things that aren't socially acceptable to think, feel, and so for me, that's a real journal practice where I write that stuff down and work as well with psychedelics, where I really go into my shadow of like the darkest dark whatever, and to have a space where that can be held by other people is profoundly helpful. And I think about that in terms of like to know that even as hard as it is, that I'm not alone. And it's not that somebody else is experiencing exactly what I'm experiencing. It's not that they're going to fix it. It's simply like being with. And that being with, I'd say, is like it is the foundation. It's going to allow me to go deeper into, an environment that's uncomfortable and the distress that's here and
Hmm.
the realities that we're facing as things kind of, I feel like it's kind of like tightening over and over. And I like was reflecting on the fact that, what we're, how many months into this administration and how many months are left in this administration. So it's not going to get easier. So this is like,
Mm.
I'm even now, right, like connecting with just some of the hopelessness that's here for me. And the idea is that not to get lost in that, it's to really recognize the space to actually open that up so that I can move into the creativity, the possibility, all the other stuff that's also there. So for me, it comes down to a fundamental choice of, all right, am I going to continue to choose fear or am I going to choose
Mm.
possibility here? And the thing is that I think of our past, if we listen to them, they will always make sure that our future looks exactly like it. And that affords safety, predictability, etc., but it prevents any possibility for change or something different.
Mm.
Mm.
Okay. So what I'm hearing here is we're in this for the long haul. I think we all know that. And in order to prepare and move through this and survive in whatever given environment we're in, we have to get we have to we I think we have to think about how we move through our lives differently than we did before. And
Yeah.
that does involve community. It involves civic engagement, which we talked about on our last episode. It involves maybe creating art, expressing yourself in some way
Hmm.
outside of the workplace. And in the long run, I would say really questioning the system that we are all a part of, and holding ourselves accountable with compassion and love to change that system.
Yeah.
And I think that just saying, I'm going to keep this job for the next 15 years and feel this way, I don't know if that's a solution. There's got to be
Right.
additional pieces of your life that you're creating, or a long-term plan to change it up completely, like Jay did, and like I've done. And yeah, so did that statement capture that correctly? Is there
I
something
think so.
you
And
want to
yeah, and
add?
like that idea is like, yeah, to what I can tolerate. And of course I
Mm,
can't meet more than I can tolerate. I do know as well, just as humans, we can experience and hold so much more distress than we think that we can. And so that, very often there's stories around that. But like, yeah, that idea of like, how do you actually move forward is still an important question because the status quo doesn't work. But I think about it in terms of like all of our fates are intertwined. So the idea of like that separation, that's not going to serve any of us, and it doesn't. And we can see that as that's playing out right now. And so, you know, I think, well, going back, let's say the environment, right? Like this idea of like, oh, when I go outside, I'm in nature. We are nature. And for us to think that we're not, and similarly, like we are the system. To think that
mhm.
we're not is or that I get to choose to be in the system or I can step out. We are the system. And that goes back to that responsibility of not just what am I going to do for me, but what am I going to do for all of us that are in this? And that is about how do I feed back into the system in a way that can actually support change that's going to be productive and helpful
Yeah,
for
that's a
everyone.
great point. It's not an overnight. This isn't going to be easy. What advice would you give to a, a business owner, a founder, or
Yeah.
an individual, an executive at a corporation, or any of us who are listening to this and thinking about saying something in a place they have not before? Maybe it's in their community. Maybe it is at work. Maybe it's actually publishing content and going through
Hmm.
this. What would you say to them?
Yeah. Well, I like to think of like, and I'm smiling here. I got my eyes closed so that like things are exactly like they are. In other words, like the choices that I'm making for very important reasons. And so if I haven't published that, if I haven't, done that, like I really respect that like this work isn't about overriding what are very important protective things back to the idea of safety. But I think that can be a really helpful thing of like, all right, well, what would that mean? Like, what is that little bit, just a touch more of safety, like in a situation? Like, what is some other kind of thing that is there that would actually allow me to open up to that rather than me forcing through that? And if all I can get is just a little nudge of that, then how can I respond to that in a little bit of a different way and a little bit more of an openness? And I think of this as just the work of opening up to the vulnerability that'll be there. And at times we're going to be met in a way where, oh my gosh, I thought this was going to be, and it's something else entirely in a beautiful way. I thought there would be all these negative ramifications, and instead there's all these positives. And you've got some of those stories in the previous podcast, right? And so, like, in order to open up, though, we actually have to be able to hold that it's going to be okay whether it's A or B.
Mm,
And so,
mm.
what needs to be there for it to be okay whether it's A or B for me?
Wow. So
I
I'm
love
kind of
that.
hearing that, there's a lot of catastrophizing going on with people.
Mm.
But the idea of that you need to be okay with if it goes the other way is interesting.
I think about Trevor Silva, our first interview. He's like, I either have to do this or I need to not be on this planet anymore. Like he talked, about how severe his need to express himself was. He
Yeah,
was, having suicidal thoughts. And wow. And look at what he's done with that. But for him, it was like, I just have to. And then there's a majority of us are towing that middle line. And yeah, that's really interesting because I have a client right now, and she's working on a book that is going to be extremely provocative, and it's a huge vulnerable move for her. And this actually came up, and I was like, listen, you've got to be okay with both scenarios, but which way do you
yeah,
want to go? Do you want to give it?
yes,
Yeah, we know what'll happen if we're safe. We know what'll happen if we stick to this and write a typical business book. But what happens if you're
yeah.
vulnerable and you go out there yeah, it could flop. It could be that nobody reads the thing. And are you
There's
okay with that?
another component to this where, like you, Elena, are very positive and tend to like have the vision, right? This is what it's going to
Hmm.
be. And it's going to be amazing. And you get excited about it. Where people like me always just catastrophizing, right? All day long. basic answer is always no, always fear, even if it's something, always suspicious, right? So the just for me, it's like the idea that it could be really great and it could be really awesome is like revelatory. So that's what I'm going to take home here.
Well, and so here, this is, finding friends who balance you in these
Yeah.
times, finding places where you can talk and hear new perspectives is really, really important. And yeah, I am sensitive to
Success
that
stories
too. I'm
too.
like, am I too positive? And that's why I say, I'm like, yeah, maybe this will be a flop. I really don't think it will. I really don't think it will be though. But
Yeah.
yeah,
I'm
okay.
very much of like, I actually hate the idea of half glass full or half glass empty. It's both. And we have to be able to hold the both of that reality. And that's the thing. Like, I'm not all unicorns and rainbows and I'm not doom and gloom. It's like there's both actually in the situations. And so,
Mhm, mhm.
the reality is what my commitment's to, not that it be a positive reality.
I love that.
Mm.
I like the idea of both things can be true, which is a sentence I hear myself say more often. I love that.
Wow. Yeah, and the theme too in the cohorts, it's absolutely fear. When we get down to everything that's prohibiting how we're showing up and the effectiveness of our content and our story and our marketing, our
Mm,
branding, even for businesses, it comes down to a fear of,
yeah.
I mean, it's all this deep rooted fear of what'll happen
Yeah.
when we express ourselves. So think about yourself as an inner child. And when you're a little kid and you said something and it was really bold and brave. And then someone in the room was like, whoa, you shouldn't say that. I mean, that's
Yeah.
what we're dealing with here. That's where my work leads a lot, Jay, which is probably similar, but just to yours in some
Yeah.
levels, but just on the that's just on the communication level.
On that
Um,
idea of
yeah.
like, you probably hear messages like, oh, well, I'm going to actually put it out there and it's going to be really bold. And then it's like, oh my gosh, I'm getting feedback. That's too much.
Mm.
And I always like to remind somebody that's actually somebody else's story that they're
Right, that's
working with, not,
theirs.
it's not yours. Yeah. Don't take
Right.
That's
that on.
theirs.
Placement. Interesting.
Yeah. And most of the time when in the case of publishing content in a story that you think is the scariest thing in the whole world to hit publish, in my experience over 20 years now, it is so well received by people who've been through the same thing. And that's why I
Oh my
always say
gosh.
it's a gift
Yeah.
for you to share it, because when you're sharing it, you're inspiring other people to share theirs, to know that they're not alone. Very rarely, and with that fear is so uncommon of bigger, broader, hands down. No, that doesn't happen. You might get one or two trolls, and the trolls are great. It's a sign that your brand's growing. So I
Mm,
get really excited. I'm like, let the troll sit, just don't respond. So I've got to coach my clients through negative comments sometimes, if I'm
yeah.
lucky, if they get to that point. One thing to MAGA administration is designed to terrorize us or people who oppose them with
Yeah.
scary fear tactics.
Right.
One one time I was in the airport, it was 2021, and a man, and he was a big guy, and we're going through the security line. The security, like the stuff's going through at TSA, and I'm waiting for my bag to come through, and he's this big guy, and his T-shirt says 2024 Make Liberals Cry Again.
Hmm.
And he's smiling at me and looking at me. And I'm like, why is this guy looking at me? You're not supposed to look at people in the security line. You got your shoes off, you got your belt off, you're vulnerable. Everyone's waiting for their shit. Don't look at me. But he made a comment, so then he starts talking to me about my jacket. And I was like, I'm flying to Denver to meet my husband and my helmet's under there or something. He was surprised, though, that the way in which I was dressed and the way in which I was cold toward him because of his T-shirt. But he was proud of it. It was like this moment in which he was really proud to be threatening to me.
Yeah.
That's how
So
I
he was
felt.
actually trying to be threatening. He
I
saw
felt
you
that
as
way.
the opposition.
Yes. And I remember we just had this conversation about the biker stuff, and that was surprising to him because I don't know, that's how I felt, Jay. And it was just the
Yeah.
way that they
Yeah.
carry themselves after when there's a victory on their end. These, particularly for me as a woman, the men
Mm,
in public places like airports, where we get a nice diverse mix of people, which we may not often be exposed to. So I say this to say, the news and the tactics of the administration are meant to terrorize us. So you can tune in selectively to certain media outlets and limit it, and be aware that this is part of the tools that they're using against you. So that's all. with that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, what you're describing, and I want to just start with that, is like I think of any kind of relational interaction that if you think about it on the level, like if it is a matter of having respect, trust, love for self as well as the other, and you're on that level, it doesn't mean that there won't be conflict, but it's never abusive. Now, what abuse is relationally is when somebody either takes a one-up stance, that's grandiosity, which is exactly what you're describing, Elena, or a one-down approach, which mirrors that. It's basically the same dynamic if somebody is coming from a place of shame. And the interesting thing is that, like, in moving off of that place, whether it is grandiosity, whether that is shame, it's actually the same exact energy. It's just like one direction or the other direction. And that is the place relationally where all harm comes from. And that's where abuse comes from. And that is exactly that dynamic that you mentioned, like even the gender aspect that was there, the way in which that's playing out, and the way in which as well that plays on wounds that are already there. And so it is a deeply and can be such a deeply painful thing when relational work is like this. The reason that I bring that up is I often refer to like the space where it can be productive as far as the interaction. It has to actually be safe. And so for people to show up like on that level to do what I call horizontal work, it means that we have to do the vertical work. And so what that might mean, and you know, it's going to look different depending on if you're on the grandiosity side or on the shame side. But like when somebody shows up, let's say like this, one up, grandiosity, actually wanting to cause harm, of course, we immediately go right to protection. And protection, when that shows up in a relational space, there's nothing productive that can happen. And so the challenge is how do you actually have the space to make sure that there is true safety in order to come back to hit it from literally a different mind? Because if we are in the mind of protection, we're not working in the prefrontal cortex, we're in amygdala, we're working in fear. And that is, to your point, that's exactly the mechanisms that the administration is using, is to keep all of us, regardless of left or right, regardless of what your political affiliation is, it's actually, it's fighting against prefrontal cortex, people actually being regulated, having conversations, having understanding, having love, respect, kindness, all the other things that would be on the level where productive stuff could happen. And it's about keeping us in a state of fear. And the thing is that is, I will offer also, just as grandiosity and shame, you know, it's the same charge, the same fear is there for all of us, regardless of political affiliation and regardless of what's happening. So in a way, we are all victims of this administration, regardless of, you know, our particular stance on, let's say, abortion or any other issue that you might think of.
Yeah, I was
So
going to
true.
mention because it's when Elena, you were saying it's you know we are being targeted, but it's like you said, everybody, right? Because it's all lizard
Yeah.
brain. Is that what they call it?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it's like we're all basically animals, and we're just doing fight, flight, fawn, or freeze, right? One of those, and it's no reasoning, and then all everything else is out the window. It's kind of was it like Mike Tyson said, you have a plan until you get punched in the face.
That sounds about right. Yeah.
And it's the idea that we want to keep people being punched in the face all the time so that we're, you know, they don't think and don't be human. I don't know.
And that,
So, go
yeah.
ahead.
No, please.
So to that end, so that, you know, creating that space, the horizontal space. And let's talk about with family who disagree with us
Yeah.
politically, because, you know, it's so common to hear, I have this relative, we don't speak anymore. And how heartbreaking is that?
Yeah.
And then we also, in the workplace, you know, you've got a boss, a person in power who is, let's say that they're vocal about this administration, and you disagree. And it's not just any other political administration. There are people dying and people being kidnapped, you know, and we've got Gaza. It's just so, it's so
Yeah.
much more than it has ever been before. So let's talk about that. How do we
Yeah.
approach these conversations in these places outside of our home?
And I think of what you're describing, and Well, I'm taking a moment here to just notice what's coming up for me, and I'm making a choice here to connect with actually, the sadness when I hear about like the genocide that is happening in Gaza, and the way as well in which there's this idea that in any way that's justified, and I can see. And I don't want to like both sides of this. It's far more complicated than that. But there is a fundamental, and this is what I think it comes down to. There's a fundamental like atrocity of violation of somebody else's humanity and so much of what's happening. And so for me, and the reason, by the way, which I really wanted to connect with that emotion here, is that this is the harder thing to do for me to actually show up to this conversation, to show up to the reality that is here and the complexity and all of the conflict, and still be able to hold it and hold the emotion. That's what I think of, like in terms of like connection, is the answer through this. And that idea of like having that space to meet, to be able to connect, it's actually through community ultimately that we will find our way out of the current circumstances. But the challenge is that it means we have to actually show up as regulated and self-regulated human beings in order for that space to be possible to exist. And then the other piece of it that I want to address is that idea of family members. And I think we've all experienced this, like the way in which that can become, where conflict can become, and in fact, maybe the only way we know how to deal with conflict is through separation. And I think of the ways in which, like, even in family systems, like when you were growing up, like that's maybe how we're taught is, well, we come in for the conflict, and basically, since we cannot resolve this, the only way is to separate. And we separate until basically it gets uncomfortable again. Then we're going to come back for that conflict, and then rinse and repeat, rinse and repeat. And the thing about conflict is, there we we only get to choose which particular conflicts we're going to spin about over and over again. There are so many that are based on values traits that aren't resolvable, in other words. And the question is, how can you actually show up in connection without necessarily having a resolve? And and where that comes back into play of this idea of like love for self as well as love for others is, it isn't a matter of overriding, my safety in order to show up in connection. And so very often what that means, and I think it's helpful to separate behaviors from an individual. There are certain behaviors. In other words, for me to come together with another person, there's certain behaviors that are in the okay range and behaviors that are outside of what I determine as okay. And I can't control anybody else. So all I can do at that point in order to honor me is to step out. And I think of it as hold the heart open with compassion, and do not tolerate that behavior. In other words, all I can do is control how I engage or disengage. But rather than it being an all or nothing thing, it can be more nuanced work. And if I'm doing the work on myself, then I may be able to show up and show up in a different way. But I guess the challenge in that is, how do I actually hold that connection without separation? And don't do that, obviously, when it's actually an abusive situation. And so this is where it's hard, because it's in this gray area. It isn't this clean black and white, yet we have a tendency to want to move to that because it does make it easier to manage. And so what I'm saying is that, like, it's holding so much complexity to be able to actually show up. And that's a really hard thing, because we have to confront all of what it is that we're feeling.
Yeah, I'm wondering, do you think there's a cultural component to this as well? Just because in this country, well, not the country, I'm in Canada right now, but in the United States, it's all about individualism and,
Yeah.
forging your own path and having your own space and freedom, and, the whole idea of solidarity and community and being able to live with people. Like where I grew up, everybody's in apartments and they all have to have shared walls, and they kind of have to figure out a way to do it. And it's
Yeah.
kind of baked in. Versus in the United States, it's you can just go. I'm just going to go to out to Idaho and get myself a big plot and never have to see a human being again.
Yes,
Yeah.
and tag on to that question, our current situation with technology, it's easier than ever to stop talking to people. You can be in your house. You don't have to have interaction with your family or anyone.
Oh, I didn't like that comment. You're
Yeah.
blocked.
Yeah, I'm
Like,
going to
done.
block you.
Yeah.
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 And Chris, I just want to say yes. Yeah, I absolutely. There's the cultural values, and I think of like that bigger system that we interact with. That those values then come through in the systems like what our parents gave us, and all the other layers in between, and that is absolutely baked in this idea of individual. And I do think that that is what is working against us at this point, because that idea of protection, and this is why it never works. I'm thinking of, by the way, the couples work that I do. Protection, when that shows up, it doesn't work because that other person doesn't matter as much as me in that moment. And
Right.
we have to own
Protection is
that,
not
right?
what do you call it, about the topic. It's not issue based. It's position based, right?
Yeah.
And that's kind
Yeah.
of where
And it's so that dynamic is it's biased, and it will always be biased in that space. So it's not going to be helpful or productive like when that's there. But I do think culturally, like, yeah, absolutely, we prioritize our I guess, yeah, that idea of being individualistic. I don't need anyone is at the core of, and I'd say it's at the core of like the fear piece as well, is that I can't trust anybody.
and
Not
also
only
the
do I
idea
not
of
want to.
fighting, right? The
Yeah.
confrontation and full
Right.
on head on, that badassness that I like to reference a lot.
Can
So,
I take this a step further, Elena?
yeah, go ahead.
I think that it's at the core wound of disconnection, particularly for men. And that
Mm.
core wound of disconnection, what we are told over and over again, and Trump is a perfect example. Like, he's the exemplar of this idea that, well, to deal with that disconnection and aloneness and insecurity, whatever that may be, like, connection is the answer. But instead, it's going the path of power. And if I have enough power, if I have enough wealth, if I have enough control, and if I have enough control, in other words, that's my way to safety. Now, it's always going to be hollow because it never actually answers the deep longing that is there, that is found through connection. So it's this treadmill that just continues to spin more, 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 more. And even the followers of Trump, I think so much of it is actually that the belief that it's not that they think that Trump's actually going to take care of them. It's that they want to be just like Trump. In other words, they want to have enough money, power, control, that's how they're going to arrive at safety and protection. And it won't address that longing. And so we're going to have to play this out, right? Until it's that ultimate devastation of, oh my gosh, that's never actually going to answer what my heart's asking for here.
Oh
And
my gosh, it's like the worst symptom ever of patriarchy. It
it
is.
is.
I mean, it's what patriarchy is
Yeah.
built on, is power
Yeah.
and control and controlling everything. Even, I'm a historian's daughter. I think I've mentioned this before, but there's a point in history in which women became property. And that's when we took your last names and we became actually part of the deal, part of the land when we stopped moving as humans, when we stopped moving across the land and we got sedentary and we're like, this is my land, this is my woman. And I can actually physically overpower her to control and make sure that she does not make me feel feelings.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And there's like
probably.
dowries too, and the idea of
Sure.
a
Yeah.
Oh,
transition
yeah.
from the father is selling it to this other person, and I don't know.
Right.
So,
Oh my gosh. Yeah.
yeah, like we could go down this, but I want to go back to I love this idea of coming to a place where your self-love and love for others, to these
Yeah.
really tough conversations with a family member. But do you have, like, for me, I hear that. I absolutely do. And we all know that when we're in that same room at Thanksgiving or whatever, and there's that tension, we're trying to control our emotions just from being in the same room and the topic hasn't even come up. Do you have any recommendations on ways to connect with people? Should it be that you're not even talking about politics at all and you're talking about the gelatin pudding or whatever? And do you keep it that way forever? But it feels to me that that's avoiding the issue entirely. And there's a point where I have some family members, I'd really like to be able to talk to them about this.
Yeah.
And I am wondering if you have words that you can give me that I could use.
Well, I think what you're describing to start with is, yeah, not every relationship has to be deep. And to really figure out which one of those where that's okay. I'm okay with the surface level. We're talking about Jello, and that some of those relationships, like that's okay that they can be that spot. I also think that we all need those deep connections. And so if it becomes a matter of like I think of that like the if that's the separation or the avoidance that's showing up of like, wow, I want to talk about this, but I feel like I can't. I mean that like in therapy, like that's exactly where we want to go is where we're avoiding, where we're resisting. But I also think it's helpful, and I think of this in terms of that work. Like it resistance, it's a good way to describe things, but it's not that helpful. What I think of is if you throw out resistance altogether, what it means is there's additional safety that's needed. And so I get curious about what safety is actually needed in order to engage, and that is a collaborative thing. And so safety first, and then the second thing is really, working on that emotional regulation of like, all right, like how can I notice what charge is coming up? I don't even need to change it. I can allow myself to get fired up. I don't need to actually respond from that place. All I have to do is simply notice it. And I can even notice it and say, oh my gosh, I'm noticing like that really like got me fired up. So I want to take a moment here to just pause for a second and really allow that to just be here. And then I want to come back to this because I do want to hear what you're saying. And I'm noticing this is getting in the way.
This sounds so interesting because it reminds me so much of parenting in a way, where
Oh, yeah.
like first thing is check in with yourself and make sure you're coming from a space that's not, from
Yeah.
emotion.
Oh,
And
yeah.
I
Mommy
wonder,
needs a timeout is a really
well,
important thing.
yeah, I'm wondering, like what I do a lot with my kids
Yeah.
is when we're talking about a topic or there's some sort of conflict, it's really
Yeah.
separating yourself from the topic and talking about how they feel, like figuring out, oh, like, oh, it seems like you really like that video game and we really wanted to get to that next level and it really sucks that you can't right now just because we got to do something else. And that typically is a way in, but it's
Yeah.
also kind of condescending. So I just wonder if that would be resonant.
So, Chris, no, I absolutely love it's a beautiful connection that you made. And the thing that I want to offer, like that deeper view, is it feels like that because, I'm sure you've said this, like when you're arguing with somebody, oh my gosh, you're acting like a child. Like, yeah, you're dealing with their child part. So that is who you're dealing with in those spaces, in those moments. And so the same skills, are working with our own like child parts, one, and being the parent to that, and then also, leveraging that like in a relational context. That idea though, as you were saying though, that it feels somewhat condescending. The part of that is that if you're noticing that something is there, there might be something actually condescending there. And I don't mean that to call you out, Chris, but like
No, it
that
makes sense.
like I think of it like get really curious about that. Like, so what part of you might actually be taking, a stance of I know better than you in this moment, and just own that. And if you can own then that's how you get back to the authenticity is, oh my gosh, yeah, I do think that I know better than you right now. And like, let's talk about how hard that is and what that feels like for you. Cause I am the parent and I do have the power and you don't. And so there's always a way to kind of like shift it back around to authenticity, not by changing what's happening, but by noticing it and then taking responsibility. And that's the vulnerable work of rather than staying on that superficial level, it's really going deeper.
This has been so wonderful. We're at the end of our episode. I think,
Yeah.
are there any closing thoughts that you guys want to share?
I would say like I have so much tremendous hope that I think of this as like this is this painful thing where we as a society we like to think that we're evolved and whatever, and like I actually think that on a societal level we're a teenage male that is rather than all elbows and knees like also has knives, and like this is a really painful part in our development. But I do trust that in the connections and the things that we're talking about here, that this is actually a necessary, even though painful, developmental cycle. And I'm so excited for what's on the other side of that. And the only thing in between that is our ability to connect with each other and to do that. And that's part of where even like this platform, to be able to talk rather than just with one-on-one with a client, to be able to have, you know, the platform that you have and the purpose that you have and the mission that you have, and all of this is it's been a beautiful thing. So aside from it being a blast to chat with each of you and you know, just play off of the conversation, yeah, I really, you know, I'm just grateful to be here.
Oh, thank you, Jay. We are grateful to you for lending us your time, and you are welcome back. We'll do another check-in with you. How's that?
Right on.
You can be our show therapist. You can help us all. You
Bring it.
know, that's a good idea. I think people enjoy this. I've been telling my friends, and the people are starting to actually listen, as I mentioned, and it's pretty great. And I've told them this episode's coming up. They're like, "Oh my gosh, I can't wait." So I think you could actually have a whole podcast of your own if you wanted. There is a need. So thank you.
There is.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jay. Really appreciate it.
Likewise.
Thanks for listening to Citizen Rebel. If you like this episode, subscribe to the show and share it with a friend.
To connect with us and find more content like this, visit goodisnow.com.